Good morning. So I think it's time to get started. So my name is Mario Telò, and I'm a professor of rhetoric, comparative literature, and ancient Greek and Roman studies here at UC Berkeley. And it's a great pleasure and honor to chair the first panel of the conference's third day of papers and conversations. The panel is entitled At Home in Exile and features three scholars who have been at the forefront of work on borders, migration, and displacement in the humanities and social sciences: Prathama Banerjee, Tom Keenan, and Debarati Sanyal. Prathama Banerjee is a professor of history and political theory at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi. She's the author of Politics of Time, Primitives and History Writing in a Colonial Society, Oxford University Press, 2006, and Elementary Aspects of the Political Histories from the Global South, Duke University Press, 2020. Today, she will speak not about the exiled intellectual, but about the rather under-theorized figure of the intellectual stranded at home and struggling to achieve autonomy in the face of totalizing mass politics. Her paper is titled Alien at Home: Institutional Autonomy in India and Elsewhere. Maybe, yeah.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. So I'll jump right in. We've already delayed for 5 minutes. So, okay. From Hannah Arendt to Salman Rushdie, Victor Hugo to Bertolt Brecht, the exile has been seen as one with special insight, which derives from her being a witness to history and a mediator of worlds. We cannot quite imagine the Frankfurt School, or post-colonial theory for that matter, without this figure. And yet, there is very little theorization around the putative other of the exile, the figure of the homebound. Today, I want to think with this figure, the intellectual at home, yet not quite, in US, India, Palestine, Turkey, and elsewhere, who is fighting for autonomy against not just state, but mass authoritarianism, often at great personal risk. I shall gloss this figure as the alien at home. I speak from my location in India about the unique perplexity of the post-colonial condition as it pertains to the academy. So until about the last third of the 20th century, there was a certain philosophical rendering of the figure of the intellectual at home. Both anti-colonialism and Marxism imagined this figure as a kind of grassroots vanguard. Antonio Gramsci's conception of the organic intellectual was one such influential imagination. From within their imbrication in place and time, Gramsci argued, organic intellectuals evolved into agents of universal history as they derived a general theory from out of their own location and elaborated them, in Gramsci's words, into a new and integral conception of the world, making it possible for organic intellectuals to be both embedded and yet global. One immediately thinks of figures like Du Bois and Ambedkar when one thinks of organic intellectuals. Gramsci famously pitted what he called the earthliness of thought of the organic intellectual against the idealism and ahistoricism of the traditional intellectual ensconced in privileged institutions of learning. In this rendering, however, the task of the organic intellectual was not to represent or identify with the masses. They were a vanguard, after all. Instead, they were to take the risk of confronting and critiquing contemporary common sense and produce a new intellectual hegemony, while drawing legitimacy from being of the masses. Gramsci's theorization of the intellectual's vocation was hugely influential until at least the 1980s. You might recall Edward Said invoking Gramsci in his 1986 Salmagundi essay on intellectuals in the post-colonial world. Gramsci's ideal of the organic intellectual as a risk-taking vanguard inspired both left politics and anti-colonial politics in India, and fed into the tradition of teachers and students spreading across the countryside to mobilize peasants and workers in mass agitations, and at times even armed struggle. This figure of the organic intellectual, willing to sacrifice herself in the name of truth and justice, was a celebrated protagonist in novels and films of the time. Today, the figure of the organic intellectual has lost its purchase. For one, the ideal of the vanguard, which derived legitimacy from the battlefield figure of the one who risked the first bullet, as well as the ideal of the revolutionary subject, founded in a historicist faith in humankind's inexorable movement towards equality, are in ruins today. For the other, and this is particularly salient to us in this context, the image of the organic intellectual was of one operating outside of institutions of learning, which was seen as the stronghold of traditional intellectuals. The grassroots thinker was expected to step out of the safe space of the academy and risk being exposed to mass politics, which is why 20th century intellectual activism, at least in India, I can say, never really engaged institutional questions, except in the limited sense of demanding that the hitherto excluded be invited into the teaching faculty and into the intellectual canon. Institutional thinking, in other words, was left to the powers that be. In the Indian case, to a centralized developmental state. Most importantly, however, in my mind, this earlier imagination of the academic activist partook in a universal normative understanding of the intellectual's vocation and defined her embeddedness, or otherwise, in purely representational terms. That is, in terms of whether she was colored, native, working class woman, low caste, indigenous, and so on. There was, and this is what has come to haunt us today, very little consideration of the diverse and often incommensurable histories of the evolution of knowledge, institution, discipline, and pedagogy in different parts of the world. So in the time that I have left, I want to dwell on this last point, which is about the historical specificity of the location of the intellectual in the post-colony and the special challenges thereof. Now, of course, in India, as in the rest of the world, intellectuals are caught between nationalism and neoliberalism. On the one hand, they face authoritarian forces which insist that research and teaching conform to a totalizing national project. On the other hand, they face business houses seeking to turn education into an expensive, exclusive, and highly capitalized private good, amenable to seamless global transaction. Also, like everywhere else, in India too, there is a general anti-intellectualism in the air, with the intellectuals seen as at best irrelevant and at worst anti-national. But while the Indian academic shares in this larger global condition, she is also subject to a very particular condition of post-colonial alienation and solitude. In modern India, higher education as we know it today was a colonial project, most famously formulated by Thomas Babington Macaulay, author of British India's education policy as well as penal codes. The purpose of modern English education in India was to create, and I cite his famous statement, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, opinions, morals, and intellect, who were to mediate between the colonizer and the colonized. Till date, the Indian academic is caught up in this impossible in-between role of an alien at home trying to translate and mediate across different languages and different publics who are suspicious of this nowhere figure of the English-speaking, world-facing intellectual. This colonial legacy articulates with the longer history of Brahmanical control of knowledge in India to make the academic appear in public eye as someone who has long monopolized the language of knowledge, now no longer Sanskrit, but English, and kept subalterns out of universities. In Gramscian terms, therefore, she is neither a traditional intellectual nor an organic intellectual. She is either too modern, meaning westernized, or too traditional, meaning Brahminized. This has led to a double quandary. Any effort to critique the colonial and or Eurocentric trappings of higher education in India leads to widespread anxiety about resurgent traditionalism and Brahmanism. But adopting the language of the global academy, especially what is seen as theory, is blamed for being Eurocentric, elite, if not anti-national. Academics in India has thus come to be reduced to a very narrow politics of representation, concerned with only who studies and teaches rather than what is studied and taught or how. The university and the classroom have come to simply mirror everyday mass politics, collapsing the distinction between academics and activism, a distinction that I want to stay with and not entirely dissolve. This has led to two further difficulties. One, the Indian academy has come into the grips of an unyielding empiricism, especially after the erstwhile hegemony of Marxist theory came to be challenged. A deadening empiricism that discourages and disables creative and critical theorization. Two, scholarship in India has become fatally nation-focused, not necessarily because of nationalism, but because it has come to be almost coterminous to domestic, electoral, and mass politics. Thinking of the world or the planet is seen as a distraction from the immediate democratic concerns of the people. But this is not entirely a recent phenomenon. I want to recall here, therefore, the triangular contest between three iconic anti-colonial thinkers of early 20th century India: Gandhi, Ambedkar, and Tagore. Gandhi, a London-educated barrister, had a strong critique of industrialism, modernity, and Western science, technology, and medicine. He started what he called a new pedagogy for the colony, a form of education based on a blurring of boundaries between manual and intellectual labor, and between pedagogue and practitioner. Gandhi, interestingly, was a self-proclaimed anti-intellectual, and his identification with the unlettered masses was expressed in frequently denigrating the intellectualism of his contemporary liberals and communists. Ambedkar, on the other hand, a born untouchable who was denied access to classical education, took wholesale to Euro-American models of higher learning, went on to study at Columbia University and the London School of Economics, spoke of American pragmatism and British constitutionalism, and gave out the rallying call of educate, agitate, and organize to fellow Dalits. Tagore, on his part, was a critic of the positivism of modern European disciplines, especially history, and the narrow intellectual vision of nationalists who identified ideas by their origin, foreign versus indigenous. He set up his own university, very different in configuration from both the German and the American models, with putatively porous boundaries between classroom and countryside, the artist and the artisan, and above all, world literature and local knowledge. He envisioned the humanities as the meta-discipline under which all subjects would be taught and learned in his institution. Gandhi and Tagore had a bitter but unresolved debate over intellectualism and about the relative importance of moral versus aesthetic education in the post-colony. With independence, however, this debate about what exactly should be the disciplinary and institutional structure of higher learning in a post-colony was suspended entirely. As the nation-state reconfirmed its commitment to colonial modern knowledge forms and institutions under the imperative of all-out modernization and development. All talk about decolonization was rejected as being obscurantist, traditionalist, and conservative. Paradoxically, and perhaps not, it is the Hindu right today which has begun invoking decolonization, by which it simply means Hinduization, leading to a reconfirmation of the older left liberal position that any talk of decolonizing knowledge is to play into the hands of reactionary forces. The result is not just a reconfirmation of the generic science versus humanities hierarchy that is common to modern academies everywhere, but a specifically post-colonial distinction between global knowledges, science, technology, and economics, and national knowledges, humanities. This is what has made the humanities subject to mass politics in India in an exceptional way, and has made history, philosophy, literature, and the arts especially vulnerable to the totalizing imperatives of democratic majoritarianism. Put otherwise, and I realize that this might sound a little blasphemous, academics in India face the challenge of over-politicization. Many academics today spend more time on media platforms, than in campus and class, because that is where the humanities are being debated today. And because Indian intellectuals feel compelled to respond to the popular allegation, not entirely untrue perhaps, of being alienated, if not foreign figures, irrelevant to the workings of democracy on the ground. But if humanities are being debated in public, they are also being debated on terms that are set elsewhere, outside contexts of research and learning. In such a condition of absolute politicization and massification, any talk of institutional autonomy seems beside the point. The university's boundaries have been breached for good. The university in India has been socialized at its own peril. The institution, to my mind, is itself at risk, not necessarily of police infiltration, which is still relatively rare in India, though it happens, but of the university dissolving into the general public sphere. For the longest time, we have argued that the university must give up its ivory tower isolation and become public-facing. That was the time when we dreamed of becoming organic intellectuals at large. Today, it seems to me, at least in the post-colony, we must fashion a new imagination of an autonomous institutional space, even a political asylum, to refer back to yesterday's discussion, where the terms and norms of debate are markedly different from the contemporary public sphere. After all, student movements in the last decade in India have been precisely about that, about the freedom of thought, speech, and action on campus, not just as a general civic right, which it is, but also as a specifically educational and intellectual right. Paul Gilroy puts it well, I think, when he says, and I cite from an interview of his here, "Within the confines of my duty of care," he says, "I prefer the idea of my classroom as a dangerous and not a safe space. It fits with my sense of the university as a unique environment where special rules apply with regard to disagreements and where we acquire a special kind of discipline with regard to the foolish and loathsome opinions of others." In other words, following Gilroy, one could say that we must return autonomy and a certain boundary to the institution of higher learning today, not by policing its borders, but by way of a thoughtful structural and procedural transformation of an institution that was simply borrowed and grafted onto the colony without due consideration of what kind of an institution works best in a mass democracy like India. I feel that it is time to reopen the early 20th century debate once again that was prematurely shut down by the modernizing state. The debate on the nature of institutional history in the post-colony, something that Mahmoud Mamdani also speaks of in his telling of the history of universities in Africa. Put otherwise, I feel to decolonize the academy in the post-colony is not only to decolonize discipline, curriculum, and personnel, but also to expand the horizons of our institutional imagination. So, to end, to be at home as an intellectual today, then, is to own up rather than disavow our condition of homelessness, institutional homelessness, our condition of post-colonial alienation and solitude, and work from there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prathama. Our next speaker is Tom Keenan, who is professor of comparative literature at Bard College, where he is also the director of the Human Rights Project. He is the author of Fables of Responsibility, Aberrations and Predicaments in Ethics and Politics, Stanford University Press, 1997, and with A.L. Weitzman, Mengele's Skull, The Advent of a Forensic Aesthetics, Sternberg Press, 2012. And today, he will propose a reflection on the confusing politics of humanitarian rescue operations. And the title of his paper is Politicizing Rescue.
Thank you, and thanks to the hosts and organizers of the extremely well-presented conference. It's difficult to speak about scholars at risk without turning pretty quickly to the prospect of protecting or rescuing them. Doing so, though, just as quickly raises a host of objections. Why remove suffering people from their risky location rather than supporting them where they are, advocating for them, or even equipping them to remain and fight? What comes after the rescue? Who's to say that the destination is better than the origin? Why is the typical east to west or south to north vector such an obvious or desirable pathway? Why treat the symptoms rather than the root causes? Why consider the existence of risk a matter of charity rather than a question of justice? Doesn't rescue venture dangerously into the territory of paternalism, or even worse, of redemption or salvation? Doesn't it risk ignoring or repressing the political? Many of these issues came up yesterday in the insightful panel on the question of who is a scholar at risk. And I found myself once again playing through the familiar and no less correct for being familiar critiques of humanitarianism, while at the same time trying to understand why it continues to feel so urgent to participate in the work of what the first audience questioner called, with the requisite apologetic quotation marks, scholar rescue. Shouldn't it be possible to engage in the critique and do the work, to live with the contradictions or the logical gap, albeit to do it a little differently, to attempt to close the gap, at least partly? Experience and theory both tell me that this is possible, if uncomfortable sometimes. And my proposition here is that we can best understand this as a matter of politicizing rescue. This is my attempt to respond to the commission that Stephen Best gave our panel when he asked us, what happens when intellectuals cannot leave their homeland? This is often the case with scholars, such as in Turkey, whose passports are confiscated preemptively by the state, or in another case where criminal cases are filed against scholars for alleged anti-national activities, as is the case in India, making getting visas difficult. At other times, scholars feel compelled to stay back to fight for the life and autonomy of their home institutions on the argument that there must be someone left behind to hold down the fort. Is there a way in which we can think globally about not just scholars, but institutions at risk? Thank you, Stephen, for that proposition. Long ago, Jackie Baba mentioned to me in passing a project she was starting. This was in February 2000. She said, by the way, we have a new initiative, Scholars at Risk, to establish a network to bring persecuted scholars to safety and employment in North American universities. I've suggested to the person we hired to direct this that he contact you. Bard is a key place for this, given the president's commitment to the issue in the past, so maybe we can join forces, unquote. Bard's president gave the keynote address at the first Scholars at Risk Global Congress in 2003, and I've been involved with them ever since. I learned recently that SAR, as it's nicknamed, which also stands for Search and Rescue, that SAR's invention had been inspired by a plea that University of Chicago lit professor Katie Trumpener sent to Jackie, who in those days headed Chicago's pioneering human rights program, suggesting that it was time for a new version of the Emergency Rescue Committee, the lifeline that helped 2,000 or so refugee intellectuals from Germany and elsewhere escape from occupied France in the 40s. Katie Trumpener's letter is worth quoting at length because it constitutes a sort of a charter for a scholar rescue project. She wrote, I was reminded yesterday of how often university professors and students, and I suppose intellectuals more generally, become particular targets of human rights abuses. I thought too of the singularly important role that European refugees played in the intellectual development of our university, Chicago, in the 30s and 40s. Then I thought with some regret that there was little chance today of equally bright professors from Algeria or Kenya or East Timor or Bosnia or any other part of the world under intellectual or political threat finding their way to Chicago. But I wonder if our university couldn't do more to increase the chance of this happening. If one of our dearest, cherished values is academic freedom, and if we also pride ourselves on being one of the world's great universities, couldn't we make it possible for professors in exile to come to teach here, at least temporarily, at least as a first place to catch their breath and think what to do next? This isn't only utopian, is it? Wouldn't it be nice if someday our university was known internationally as a place of intellectual refuge and sanctuary? Unquote. That was December 1997. That sentiment is still at the core of scholar rescue programs, I would say. This was the origin of what is now a 500-plus institutional network, a global, decentralized, bottom-up expression of solidarity that harnesses local initiative and funding to offer refuge to hundreds of displaced scholars each year. Much of what is interesting about scholar rescue projects is already visible in this message: the sense that academics are particular targets for repression, a certain modesty and humility, we can't do everything but, a matter-of-factness about the problem, how often it happens, a sense of solidarity and collegiality with professors elsewhere who could, quote, come to teach here, a minimalist expectation of temporariness, a first place to catch their breath and think what to do next, and the obviousness of the solution. We should do it. At the same time, the core structural dilemmas of the field are immediately clear. In the face of mass political phenomena, small-scale ethical initiatives are proposed, and this humanitarian response is easily understood as both necessary and as painfully inadequate. 20-something years later, though, there is a lot of activity in the field, even if these structural dilemmas have not been overcome. SAR is joined today by a wide range of similarly motivated but differently structured projects. And I was going to give you a map of that, but Jane Newman did it yesterday. The good parts of this now very rich ecosystem are obvious. The programs enjoy wide support, are implanted all over the world, and do actually bring persecuted scholars to safety and employment in universities, as Jackie had hoped. The problems are also obvious and well-known, persistent and structural, which means they are resistant to technical fixes. They're also so numerous that sometimes the fact that any of these programs actually do anything at all seems miraculous. Here's a quick rundown of the flaws, dangers, risks, many of which, again, came up yesterday, but I think it's important to air them fully here, given what I want to say next. So here's a list. Funding, how to pay for all these people. The logistics of relocation, most notably confronting restrictive visa and migration regimes, but also the very real and always underestimated issue of taking care of newcomers in the most ordinary and essential parts of their lives. School for the kids, doctors, cars, counseling, culture shock, prejudice and discrimination, language. Understanding how to assess risk and threat and how to prioritize, or not, certain kinds of threats over others. Natural disasters, wars or other armed conflicts, identity-based violence or discrimination, censorship or political or legal repression, etc. Breaking out of the obvious solution, bring them to Chicago, and thinking creatively about different kinds of solutions, regional relocation, remote fellowships, and so on. Balancing between the urgency of emergency relocation and the need for and absence of long-term commitments to employment, which is only exaggerated by the condition of precarity that characterize so many systems of higher education in so-called advanced capitalist countries. confronting institutional inertia, self-protection, risk aversion, and bureaucratic opacity, and recognizing that the resistance is not just bureaucratic, it also comes from our academic colleagues themselves, their narrowly drawn job descriptions, their traditions of institutional self-reproduction, and their defense of privilege. Expanding institutional understandings of what a scholar is to include artists, writers, journalists, activists, and other intellectuals for whom a university is a perfectly reasonable, but too often inhospitable sanctuary. The tension between the ideal of excellence and the reality of large numbers of scholars trained in different systems and without much prior exposure to the mechanisms of accreditation and the professional networks of the host nation's academic ecosystems. The danger of brain drain, intellectual resource extraction, cherry picking, and poaching of vulnerable talent. The dynamic relation between honoring the desire to return, recognizing the reality of its unlikelihood, negotiating tight and protectionist academic job markets, and creating alternative career pathways for displaced colleagues. And finally, the fact that emergencies come in fast-breaking geopolitical waves. Sudan, Russia, Ukraine, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Belarus, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Gaza now, which creates pressures for immediate responses and quick fixes and can lead to ethically and politically problematic shifts of funding, attention, and response. Some of these problems could be addressed, at least in part, by a significant commitment of philanthropic and other support to build robust and long-term infrastructures. Some can be worked by the patient labor of advocacy and persuasion within institutions to change assumptions and expectations. Some might respond to practical demonstrations of the value to institutions of hosting scholars and of integrating them into academic communities, their perspectives, networks, accomplishes, experiences. But short of a general overhaul of university systems in host countries, many of these dilemmas are intractable. Nevertheless, there are ways of rethinking the ones that derive from the tension between treating the symptoms and addressing the causes. It's true, and a cliche, that there are no humanitarian solutions to political problems, only political ones. But I think we're now at a moment in the life of these would-be apolitical humanitarian initiatives when the properly political nature of scholar rescue projects can come to the fore. I would suggest an analogy with another practice of rescue, the situation of humanitarian rescue ships in the Mediterranean, whose life-saving actions have been prevented and even criminalized by the democratic states of Europe's South. In impounding NGO ships and arresting rescuers, the Greek and Italian governments, among others, identify rescue not as a merely humanitarian gesture, but as a political act, a challenge and a rebuke to the weaponization of the sea and the fortification of borders, a response to a migration regime, a response that would be unnecessary if it were to change. Likewise, the volunteers from No More Deaths and others who bring life-saving assistance to people walking through the deserts on the southern border of the United States and who have been arrested and tried for these actions. The governments in these cases do not make a distinction between symptoms and root causes, do not see rescue as mere charity or a Band-Aid, but treat rescue as a political threat. Similarly, if the reasons for academic displacement and hence for rescue are political, repression, autocracy, deliberate targeting, then the act of rescue itself can assume a political dimension and authorizes, as it were, those who offer and those who receive these fellowships to treat them as political platforms. Authoritarian states and democratic ones alike have already politicized rescue, seeing clearly the threat that is posed by a bunch of kids waiting for the rafts on Samos and another bunch of kids sleeping on top of RVs in the Sonoma to their restrictive border policies. We should too. Embracing a political practice of scholar rescue, politicizing rescue, whether proactively or reactively, means not just protecting the physical or psychic well-being of scholars at risk, but providing platforms, institutional structures, infrastructures to support them as political actors. These can take a variety of forms. Challenging the repression they face legally or through international institutions, linking or clustering threatened scholars with other political actors outside and inside their countries of origin and defending those networks, supporting them remotely rather than fully relocating them in places closer to home that allow them to remain connected to political processes and groups, media, and public platforms, helping them create new institutions in exile that gather knowledge, develop strategies, and provide resources for ongoing advocacy and academic work that matters in their countries of origin. These can take place at the institutional level, but also at the larger scale of entire institutions, as Stephen suggested. When intellectuals cannot leave their homeland, we need to create ways to support them where they are. I now have a colleague teaching human rights and literature on Zoom from Kashmir, for example, and another pursuing their research in the Middle East from a state they cannot get out of. Sometimes that requires creativity in delivering funds and in operational security, but this is not an impossible mission. And when intellectuals can leave and we can support them where they are, it's important to support them not just as scholars, but as civic actors as well, if they understand their work that way, and treat their engagement with the politics of their homeland as an essential part of what we are enabling. When not just institutions, individuals, but entire institutions are targeted, there are also ways to respond. Many of us have been inspired by the remarkable and sustained operation of Off University, built out of the purges of the Academics for Peace professors, which has not only taught students and employed many threatened scholars, but which has also played a major role in expatriate organizing, and many of whose participants have now had their cases in Turkey dismissed or have been acquitted or had their passports returned. Likewise, Smolny Beyond Borders, the online successor institution to the banned Smolny College at St. Petersburg State University, and the Russian Independent Media Archive, built by the exiled journalists of TV Rain and other undesirable independent media from Russia, undesirable in quotation marks, legal quotation marks, have little by little recreated a heterodox intellectual milieu for Russia and Russians from outside Russia. Prathama University of Myanmar, whose students and faculty were arrested, fled, took up arms, or escaped into exile, has now reconstituted itself as an online US-based institution. The American University of Afghanistan moved to Doha, dispersed its faculty and students around the world, created a brand new online curriculum, hired newly displaced faculty, and continues to educate students and practice another vision of knowledge and learning than the one dominant at home. The Sudan Crisis Research Initiative, a loose network of social scientists now scattered within and around Sudan, was not preserved, but in fact created as a response to the return of civil war, and has demonstrated that scholars can pursue their research and play a role in the rebuilding of civil society better together than alone. Similarly, the Invisible University for Ukraine has gathered hundreds of academics and taught thousands of students in person and online for 2 years now. And plans are today afoot for a Gaza virtual university, among other initiatives focused on that catastrophe. In almost all cases, these are responses to direct threats to scholars, students, artists, intellectuals, and their institutions because of what they do. They are natively political. And today, I think any response to threatened scholars needs to understand its practice in that way. As Trumpeter pointed out, it's striking how often university professors and students become particular targets for human rights abuses. There are no doubt many reasons for this, but that's for another talk. For now, and with this particular moment in mind, I'm left contemplating a genre of images from Gaza. I won't show them, it's too depressing, but you've probably seen them. I'm watching the glee, the exhilaration on the faces of Israeli soldiers as they film themselves blowing up Palestinian universities on purpose. Their demonstration and satisfaction exemplifies a more widely shared sentiment. And we need to face that fact as we build the next generation of scholar rescue programs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. So The next speaker is my colleague and my dear friend, Debarati Sanyal, who is professor of French and critical theory here at UC Berkeley, where she holds the Zaffaroni Family Chair in undergraduate education and is the director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Critical Inquiry. She's the author of The Violence of Modernity, Baudelaire, Irony and the Politics of Form, Johns Hopkins University Press, 2006, Memory and Complicity, Migrations of Holocaust Remembrance, Fordham University Press, 2015, and the forthcoming, much-awaited Arts of the Border, Fugitive Bodies at the Edges of Europe. And today she will speak on borders, security optics, kinesthetics.
I think I'll just stay seated then. So my thanks to Stephen for inviting me to share some thoughts on risk in the context of borders and migration, and to the tireless organizers and staff who are working on this event. I'm going to return us to some of the topics that were addressed yesterday afternoon at the Borders, Citizenship, Statelessness panel. So we're going to be moving a little bit away from the question of the university, but I'm hoping that there will be some resonances nevertheless. So my paper is going to be in two parts. The first is going to reflect on territorial borders and their security optics on illegalized migrants. And then the second part will address aesthetic, or what I call kino-aesthetic experiments that challenge these optics while putting categories such as the human, the animal, and the ecological into question, if not at risk, in order to expand their protection, if not their rights. So borders are key sites of risk management that allow for the securitized circulation of goods and people while blocking and pushing back illegalized or irregularized others, as Nando Sigona put it yesterday. Barbed wire was originally designed to contain livestock and then used for human encampment. But the 100 miles of razor wire that now fortifies the border between Texas and Mexico is made of galvanized steel and intends to maim. As they try to cross borders, migrants are quite literally crossed by the border. Meanwhile, with its CCTVs, drones, and thermal cameras, the border's optics cast migrants as dehumanized swarms, hordes, and flows. Security optics make what Michel Foucault called a racialized cut, sorting those on the move into human, infrahuman, parahuman, inhuman, classifying what may live and what may be kept in abeyance, if not left, or even made to die. White supremacist xenophobia uses these security optics in phantasms of reverse colonization and great replacement. The white nationalist group Europe Rising, for instance, recycled security footage of African border shockers, so border shockers who are actually crossing from Morocco into Ceuta and Melilla, which are EU, Spanish enclaves, so technically in the EU. So there's footage that's being used by white supremacist groups to warn against Europe's reverse colonization by Muslims from the global south and the threat of white genocide. And I just want to show you a little piece of that unsavory footage, which was actually sourced from Vice News, which is kind of interesting. Great. There should be sound, but it's not a problem. Right, I think that's enough. Apologies for that. So, ironically, this footage is actually sourced from Vice News. Now, the same footage actually was recycled in Donald Trump's 2016 bid for the presidency and his vow to build a big, beautiful wall. The confusion between Mexico and Morocco was either geographical ignorance or canny fear-mongering about the savages at America's frontiers. And indeed, Trump's most recent designation of illegal immigrants as animals, not human, is a clear sign that borders remain battlegrounds for imagining the boundaries of the human species itself. In the name of security, borders cut into living bodies as border security optics project a cut into the continuum of the species. Borders aren't just materialized as walls or fences partitioning territories, they're membranes that selectively filter and regulate the movement of bodies. Biometric identification, for instance, differentially targets moving bodies in relation to their race and risk factors. Smart borders wield formidable powers of capture, as we all know from going through airports. They materialize bodies as pure physiology through carbon dioxide probes or heartbeat monitors, and at the same time, they metaphorize our bodies as bits of data. These procedures of digital epidermalization turn those on the move into machine-readable bodies with contradictory effects of materialization and derealization. And they also massify and singularize the displaced simultaneously, since biometrics capture an individual's unique data signature. As migrants pass through the border, they are not just recorded and policed by these technologies. They are remade as expropriated bodies and risky personhoods. If, for Hannah Arendt, refugees were at the vanguard of the population because they grasped that they were nothing but human beings, illegalized migrants have an intimate knowledge of this shared condition. We are all potentially expropriated bodies and risky personhoods under the security state and its anticipatory surveillance. But of course, the risk is far greater for certain bodies with their perceived race, class, and risk factors than for others. Border technologies are constantly innovating, but they freight old histories of racialized violence. Security optics rehearse the kinds of species cuts produced in the colonial encounter. In The Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon described the colonial relation as a division between two species that relegates the colonized population to zoological abjection. The settlers' imaginary of the native population is animalistic, full of breeding swarms, hordes of vital statistics, and faces bereft of humanity. This is Fanon, of course, ventriloquizing the colonial imaginary. But on the other side of this colonial bestiary, muscular counterviolence held the promise of struggle and liberation. For Fanon, a new species of humans emerged through this counterviolence, with decolonization and national belonging as its horizon. By contrast, the post-colonial security state produces populations as statistical entities, as flows to be regulated. Fanon's diagnosis of colonial geopolitics remains pertinent for the xenophobic discourses, policies, and practices of our global border regime. New technologies of surveillance and classification reanimate racial and colonial hierarchies. Meanwhile, machines mediate the encounter with racialized bodies and dematerialize these bodies into data, seemingly undoing the possibilities of escape or emancipation, indeed of struggle itself. Nowhere is this clearer than in the risk management that we see at borders. Security has a distinctively preemptive temporality with profiling technologies that anticipate criminality in attempts to future-proof. As security scholar Didier Bigot puts it, this secured future is always a future anterior, a future perfect, based on assumptions embedded within stereotypes concerning race, poverty, and inequality, unquote. The future perfect conveys security's grammar of time in which a crime is imminent and will have been committed if it's not preempted by algorithms. We see this in current discourses of border policing, which include terms that we're familiar with like migration risk, crime-migration nexus, and police intuition. Future-proofing, in effect, defutures the displaced. The face is a key site of capture in this brave new securitized world. Facial recognition technology is weaponized for predictive policing as well as tracking, deporting, and detaining illegalized migrants. And here, as you may know, in the US, the controversial Clearview AI scrapes public images from social media to aid ICE. Contemporary American artist Trevor Paglen offers a powerful representation of the colonial continuities in the border's biometric capture of life, as well as security's grammatical tense of the future perfect, in which a future threat will have been neutralized. One of his pieces on dead revolutionaries and philosophers is a posthumous biometric portrait of Frantz Fanon. The theorist of revolutionary action and of dissidence from the border is cast here as a captive shadow on the brink of disappearance. Fanon, even the dead are not safe, quoting Walter Benjamin, is a composite of features processed by facial recognition software. Paglen scraped all the images of Fanon from the internet to produce a meta-image, extracting the features that the revolutionary's physiognomy shares with others to come up with a unique fingerprint of his face. By projecting the theorist of bodily counterviolence as a machine-readable ghost, Paglen alerts us to the perils of a future perfect that would preclude the existence of unruly bodies, militant lives, and cross-border thoughts. So, in the time that remains, I'd like to consider how experimental art like this posthumous rendering of Fanon counters the border regime's security optics and challenges its techniques of risk management, its anticipatory surveillance, and the cuts that it projects between territories and species. Borders are routinely crossed and redrawn and reimagined by migrants themselves who craft more capacious views of becoming and belonging that are echoed and accompanied by experimental art. And I'm interested in the nuance that artistic alliances bring to the documentation and theorization of particular borders as sites of risk management, humanitarian rescue, biopolitical regulation, and necropolitical violence. The works I discuss in the book that I've just finished and that Mario mentioned are not only highly aesthetic, they're kino-aesthetic insofar as their dynamic forms convey the force of bodies that are on the move. Kino-aesthetics from the Greek root kino, or to set in motion, and aesthetics, or relating to sensory perception, draws together the senses, the body in motion, and the image in its capacity for circulation. Kino-aesthetics turns our attention, I hope, towards the lived experience of singular and embodied subjects in contact with other beings and things in the environments they cross, and the kinds of worlds that are created, that are being built by these encounters and in these spaces that are perhaps neither sanctuary nor exile, to come back to our panel's title. So I'll be talking about John Akomfrah, artist and theorist Sir John Akomfrah, who is himself a refugee. Born in Ghana, he fled with his mother after his father was killed during the ousting of socialist Pan-African Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of independent Ghana. Akomfrah often recalls the terror of their flight and the palpable sense of relief at finding refuge in the UK, a country that he represents today at the Venice Biennale. And I haven't seen his installation, but if you had, please talk to me about it. But his work consistently undoes the binary of exile and sanctuary. And I imagine that the leitmotif we see in his oeuvre of domestic interiors in ruins or in construction, emerging out of rubble and exposed to the elements, have something to do with being raised in what he calls the House of the Vanquished, an Accra in London, a home in exile. The different phases of Akomfrah's oeuvre from the 1980s, when he was a founding member of the Black Audio Film Collective, to the more recent multi-channel installations, such as the trilogy of Four Nocturnes, Vertigo Sea, and Purple, constantly cross the boundaries and borders in a commitment to movement at the level of form and content. The movement of bodies across borders, the movement of memories through image and frame, the movement of past into present and vice versa, the movement between living things and their ecology. The interplay of image, text, and sound conveys the force of bodies on the move, conveys their kino-aesthetic powers of fugitivity. In contrast to the racialized cuts of security optics that humanize on the one hand through the production of the animalized other, Akomfrah's visual frames undo the boundaries between species. I was thinking here of whether this was similar to Fauna Forman's mention of unwalling experiments yesterday. Humanity is plotted on a continuum with animality and the environment in what is a political ecology of sorts. Vertigo Sea, for instance, is a meditation on memory that connects the so-called refugee crisis to the transatlantic slave trade, the whaling industry slaughter, the elimination of political dissidents, with the ocean as an archive of the disappeared. A reminder that today we do not have a refugee crisis, but a border regime governed by risk management techniques that rehearse old histories of enslavement, predation, and extraction. Akomfra's 3-channel video installation, Four Nocturnes, is subtitled An Allegory of Entanglement and Porosity. Now, allegory from allos or other is a rhetorical figure that is constantly reaching for the other to establish a relationship with it. We're not going to get into allegory, but similarly, the 3-channel installation entangles the fates of humans, animals, and ecosystem in frames, membranes that reveal their porosity to one another. They include archival photos of big game, of colonial era big game hunters that frame and slice into a forest's lush vegetation and precede an image of deforestation, logging. Shackled elephants pushing logs in a forest, followed by a photo of shackled men nested in cut roots next to images of a lush forest with the sound of buzzsaws cutting down trees. A pair of elephants grieve a dead kin in an encounter that's visually echoed in the prone bodies of migrants at some unknown territorial border, framed by barbed wire. Note the knots foregrounded in the middle image that challenge the separation between human and animal associated with barbed wires and that knot their fates together. Elsewhere, an aerial view of desert dunes connect migrating elephants and elephant-headed migrants. The montage does not propose an analogy between the human, animal, and ecological in a figural relationship that's grounded in anthropocentrism so much as an entanglement of bodies within a shared habitat. This network view of spaces and bodies challenges the cuts that the border makes between spaces and species. Akomfra's adjacent screens places humans, organisms, and the elements side by side within a broader planetary ecology in frames that are more like membranes exposing a shared realm of livingness and relationality, as well as a shared risk of extinction in the colonial Anthropocene. Now, Akomfra has suggested that his montage and allegories of entanglement are ways of imagining collective life otherwise in provisional forms of sociality, perhaps even politicality. He's unclear about this. As a way of, and I quote him, thinking the unthought, he asks us to reconsider the relationship between the human and other forms of life in light of colonialism, racialization, and the environment. What does this look like politically, he asks. How does the erosion of species boundaries and territorial borders in such experimental works raise the question of politics and rights for beings on the move? The closing sequence of Four Nocturnes gives clues to what that might look like, though it's still pretty baffling. I'm just going to give you my tentative take. So I have time to show you. So basically, you're going to see city lights that give way to a family of nomads who are pointing out stars, and this is possibly a staged tableau. These are put next to news footage of President Kwame Nkrumah, who is then put next to time-lapse photography of night skies and cactus blooms. And hopefully, thanks. I mean, it's pretty weird. But in a famous independence speech to the UN, Nkrumah evoked the blazing African sun now traveling across the sky of Africa's redemption, a declaration that seems strangely visually echoed in the traveling stars of night skies that accompany the footage of the president. But the last sequence of 4 nocturnes doesn't resolve as an allegory of Ghana's birth in a heroic narrative of colonial liberation and nation formation. Prior to this scene, we've had multiple instances of footage of military violence against civilians that signals the authoritarian turn of the Nkrumah presidency. Instead, the nocturnal body of post-colonial states, with its linkage of nomads, stars, plants, creatures, and statecraft, returns us to the entanglements of boundaries and borders and time, with which I began. Akomfra's portrayal of time is neither linear, the time of nation building, nor of catastrophic repetition, the time of allegory. And if the time of security is the future perfect of anticipated criminality, Akomfra's experiments give us a coexistence of times, as he calls it, one that puts the categories of the nation state and that of the human as citizen at risk. It is a time of entanglements and aftermaths that resurrects past promises like Pan-African socialism as it reaches towards new forms of becoming and belonging. So, to conclude, for Hannah Arendt, refugees bereft of nation states as guarantors of their rights were expelled from the human community and reduced to specimens of the human animal, deprived of spontaneity and agency. The racialized violence and violations of rights that we see at borders across the world illustrates over and over that the human is an unstable, perhaps even insufficient category to anchor the protections that our human rights regimes claims to give to the stateless, even if the human remains indispensable today. The human and nothing but human has always been produced in relation to its shadow others. These histories continue to be rehearsed at the border as security cuts between bare life, wildlife, and qualified life. Kino-aesthetic experiments like the one I've evoked give sensuous and kinetic form to the unfinished project of decolonization. Akomfra also reminds us that climate change is one of the greatest risks we face today as interconnected species sharing the planet. But in defining refugees, international law persists in separating environmental damage and economic destitution from political persecution, rather than recognizing the inevitable entanglement and porosity of these drivers of displacement. In this regard, Akomfra's work gestures, I think, towards the ever-urging task of conceptualizing, alongside the coexistence of time, the coexistence of conditions that increasingly put the prospect of a livable life at risk for the millions across the planet today who feel that they have no choice but to be on the move. Thanks.
So thank you so much, Debarati, and it's not easy to say something after such moving and powerful presentations, but perhaps what I can say to get us started in terms of discussion and responses to the paper is that what you said, Debarati, about Akomfra's problematization of the boundary between sanctuary and exile brings me back to an important element that I think the previous presentations share, that is the need for constantly valorizing risk and homelessness as critical theoretical tools in the classroom and at the institutional levels for politicizing home and rescue, that is, for pushing against liberal and neoliberal attempts to stabilize these categories, home and rescue, and for depoliticizing them, that is, for preemptively blocking the kind of heuristic counter-imaginaries that can emerge from our focusing on risk as what always haunts rescue, and homelessness as what constantly rescues conventional notions of home. So maybe, this could be a general starting point for the three of you to respond to each other, and perhaps then we can also open it up to the audience. Please.
So it feels like jazz. Do what you please. Thank you very much, Mario. I'm like, it was a pleasure and very learning to listen to both of you. And I think that when Stephen and I were discussing the original format of this panel, and at least I was thinking the figure of the exile and the figure of the homebound as binaries, as dichotomies, and I was in fact thinking that the valorization of the figure of the exile in some ways undercuts the efforts that are going on in the ground all across the world to stay back and fight. Thinking further and listening to all of you, I think that that binary is overstated, and that there is a continuity between the experience of what I was calling alienation at home and being looking for a home, making homes in the way that Afroma does, so the kind of disassembled homes elsewhere in the world. So there is more of a continuity between these two conditions of being, and it's probably more productive to think of it in those terms rather than as people who have to move and people who have to stay, right? So yeah, just a comment on the overall remit of this conversation. Thank you, yeah.
I have to say, as I was listening to your paper, I was having a lot of second thoughts about my paper. But by the end, I thought maybe there's a way of squaring the circle. And I think what you were teaching us was about really the specificity, the importance of being super specific in your political strategies based on where and when you are and who your opponents are. And I was persuaded by your argument for the defense of, let's say, institutional autonomy and a certain kind of neutrality, or of stepping outside of defending a space outside of mass politics. I don't think that would make me retreat from my sense that in other contexts one wants to politicize this, but I'm persuaded by the necessity of the different strategies in the different places. I thought it was very valuable insight that you had there. So, and it's probably, I don't think it may be specific to India, but I don't think it's limited to India. I think there are other situations in which I know, in the Hungarian situation with Central University, they tried to do that, and they finally had to basically chop the university in half and leave half of it in Budapest and move half of it to Vienna. That's another strategy. So the ones who stayed at home continued to battle for their autonomy and their intellectual and academic freedom. The ones at a distance have a bit more liberty to go after the regime from a safer distance. So.
But I would like to hear more about how you each understand politicization, which isn't a universal, of course, right? I mean, you can politicize in ways that are deemed emancipatory, and others that are completely complicit with say, Hindutva ideology, which is the kind of classroom environment that you were describing, Prathama. And so I think maybe we have to think about politicization in more local specific terms. Right? And in terms of the intertwinement of home and exile, I think that a Komfra, there is a work of aestheticization, right? That actually sometimes feels like we're back to the 1990s and the celebration of the nomad, and which I'm aware of as being, kind of a bit of a problem because people on the move are seeking sanctuary. But it is interesting for me. I'm very interested in, how should I say, settlements, encampments that turn into proto-polis. So Stephen, you were asking us to think about, this kind of sanctuary versus exile, and I'm really interested in these provisional habitations that are, without wanting to idealize them in any way, like, Calais jungles or the so-called ghettos of migrant ghettos at the edges of Morocco and the Spanish enclaves, where people are nevertheless producing forms of sociality and what I call arts of the borders, and that kind of do dismantle that home and exile without without in any way questioning that most people in forced migration are seeking a home. But often they're being stopped at places that they don't want to stop at. They actually want to get to England or wherever. Yeah. I don't know if that answers some of your...
Are there any questions from the audience?
Thank you for coming a long way with the microphone. I'll try to ask a question. Thank you very much for this panel, which raises a lot of questions. Maybe this is one that's directed more to Thomas and how Bard College deals with the notion of risk in a very practical manner. I'm just wondering if we talked about the definition of risk and contradistinction to danger, but I think what we haven't talked about is the risk to what. So how do you assess? Risk can be anything, right? So I just want to maybe bring into conversation a problem that I see in Germany with the Philipp Schwarz initiative. They have supported the peace petitioners who were against who protested against the attack on the Kurdish civilians in 2015-16. But at the same time, they've also supported the Gülenists, whose universities were shut down at the same time. So this was all around the military coup attempt in Turkey. So they've hosted both the ones who are, members of our community asking for democracy, advocates for democracy at universities, and at the same time, they've also invited those who have created universities that have a religious mission. And at some point, Erdogan decided that they are not, part of his alliance, so he shut down those universities. So the professional ban was against both groups. And the Philipp Schwarz initiative did make a distinction between these two groups. So I think we need to, just because I know that example well, it could apply to other countries, Libya, for example. A dissident in Libya could still be supporting the Gaddafi regime or had somebody who had privileges during the Gaddafi regime and then had to go into exile. Who are we actually talking about? Where do we channel our resources into? Which risk are we actually talking about? The risk to liberal democracy, or, what do you want to call it? And I think that's important then, once we know, we can assess like what that risk actually is that we're talking about, what we want to protect. Then we can talk about risk assessment, which is a very, very hard thing to do in practical terms, and we can talk about it in a theoretical manner, but we need to have a tool to decide how we assess risk if we are in the so-called business of so-called scholar rescue, which many of us do in one way or another. So it's an ethical decision to make, and I'm just wondering what your experience with that is.
That is a fantastic example. And made a very clear decision about this. And I'm not speaking for BARD here. I'm speaking for an initiative that I was involved in through something called the Open Society University Network, which had a Threatened Scholars project. So in the Turkish case, and so it's not there's no tool, I'm gonna say, there's no neutral instrument which can do this evaluation for you. It's a political judgment call that varies from situation to situation. In the Turkish situation, we made a very clear decision to support the Academics for Peace people, the people who were advocating for a democratic Turkey that included Kurdish citizens as full citizens, and we did not support or defend Gulenists. We made that judgment that there was a very different content to the politics, and our values committed us to offering the services of this enterprise to some, but not all. And that was in keeping with a broader position that we had, that we were in not just the scholar rescue business, but the democracy promoting business too, and that all risk, as you say, was not equal. I mean, they might have been equally subject to the whims of the Turkish state, but we thought that we were capable of distinguishing between different kinds of political risk at different moments. And that you either need to be God and be able to see everything and distinguish finally between things everywhere, or you need to limit the places you work in to the places you know at least enough about so that you won't make mistakes of that sort. So that was the judgment we made. We were not offering fellowships to people who got caught in earthquakes or hurricanes or whatever. We limited our pool of potential candidates to survivors or targets of political repression, including identity-based and other sorts of political repression. And we tried to limit the places we worked in to places that we knew something about or knew who we could ask for reliable political judgments. So that's how we solved that. It's not a perfect thing, and it's definitely not a general rule, but we parted ways with the Schwartz Initiative and with some other organizations in the ecosystem to make a much more, we thought, determined political judgment about who we wanted to spend our money on, put it that way.
A question there.
Hi, thank you for three wonderful papers that actually took us in three different directions and allowed us to think along sort of different paradigms. Just a brief comment. For a long time, I thought, okay, I can talk to Prathama anytime. I don't need to sort of, but then I thought, no, maybe there is some value to sort of putting my thoughts out there, which is that, so I'll try and be brief, but basically to complicate the line that you're drawing, Prathama, from the Macaulayan, the much quoted Macaulayan line, which, as you know yourself, is historically sort of Indians pushed for an education in English long before the English actually formulated, I mean, long before Macaulay's line. This just comes out of my work in the 19th century. But more importantly, actually, I think two things. One, of course, and that comes out in your sort of presentation of Ambedkar himself. And as you know, Dalits themselves right now, one of them indeed has raised a temple to a goddess of the English language, because the English language is empowering for the Dalits, and they have pushed very hard to say that they want it because it is a language that does not bear caste markers. So there is another narrative there of how the English language has enabled and how Indians have pushed for it. So this argument that can be made from that angle. The other one is to do with the figure of the intellectual as the alien at home. And again, it comes from this line in Macaulay, in fact, that has been quoted so often. And this is a thought that is relevant to Hindutva politics today, because what they have done is they have weaponized this, and they've used it against intellectuals like you or me, who you're categorizing as aliens at home. And I think we need to push back against being characterized as aliens at home, to say that actually, and even if you, even historically speaking, and even now, that we don't feel like aliens at home. We are very much at home, and we are doing our work, and that this category of alien at home actually enables a discourse of, pseudo-secular and, the English-speaking elite, which just needs to be a little more complicated, made a little more complicated than just that straight line from Macaulay to aliens at home.
Yeah, totally
But
agree
we'll
with
talk.
you. Totally. Agree with you on all counts. One, by now, I think we would all agree that English is the, 26th Indian language. So we have languages. There's nothing called an Indian language, right? There are many languages, and English is one of them. And it is true that English is relatively less caste-marked, but it is very deeply class-marked. And we cannot but, there is the public polemic of the goddess of the English language, but I see it as that. I see it as a public polemic. I don't see it as a kind of philosophically or theoretically or even politically plausible argument beyond a point. To my mind, the question of language and decolonization in the post-colony is about bringing translation at the heart of the story rather than at the edges of it. So I'm sure you would also agree. Very briefly, to my mind, one of the reasons why one of the problems of being political as an academic is that many of our critical concepts have been malappropriated by conservative forces. So decolonization is a weapon in the hand of any critique of how educational institutions have evolved in India is weaponized by which in some sense is what we have done prior to the moment of the rise of Hindu authoritarianism, is that we have not taken the bull by its horn because of the fear that it could be weaponized in another way. To my mind, I think it is equally important to sidestep the danger of decolonization being nativist, which is why I think that there is an insight to be had in being at home and yet not entirely so. There is a way in which it enables a certain kind of self-reflexivity to say that, oh, I am not entirely at home where I'm born. And I want to embrace that self-reflexivity rather than telling those people that, oh, I am as Indian as you. That hasn't worked. Every Muslim in India carries the national flag. And what does it do for them? Nothing. So, yeah.
Okay, time is up. So we need to go, but not before having given another round of applause to our wonderful speakers.